Hello and welcome to the Sales Leaders series. I'm your host, Freddie, where I'll be gathering B2B SaaS sales leaders from across the world to answer 5 short, topical B2B SaaS sales questions. These questions are going to be the same each week, bar one, giving you insight and different perspectives into how top performers within the industry think, as well as actionable advice you guys can use in your own selling careers. Our guest this week is Ryan Staley. Ryan has over 20 years of software selling experience, from being in sales consultant roles in the early 2000s at companies like Marcus Evans and Pitney Bowes to heading up strategic accounts as a VP at Flex Technology Group in 2018. Ryan has vast experience in scaling sales organizations. Ryan is also a founding member in globally recognized sales communities such as RevGenius and Sales Hacker. As an active member in the go-to-market community as well, Ryan also teaches in pavilion, CRO, and enterprise sales courses. To date, he has taught over 800 vice presidents of sales and CROs on enterprise sales and go-to-market strategy as part of that program. Most recently, Ryan uses his knowledge to help other SaaS founders and revenue leaders unlock high ACV growth and potential with his consultancy firm, Whaleboss. Alongside this, consulting and teaching, Ryan is also a host of The Scale Up Show, a podcast dedicated to breaking down the mindsets behind top SaaS CEOs and how they've built their companies repeatably and predictably. Ryan, I've been looking forward to this conversation. It's great to have you on.
Yeah, man. Happy to be on. Really looking forward to it as well. And slight minor tweak. My experience is that all in software, there's managed services and software in there as well. So anyway, this is minor correction.
In sales in general, I know you've had a lot of experience in, as you say, so management services and software. It's all going to be relevant today, and hopefully for those listening, you'll get some great advice from Ryan's experience. Ryan and I, we met in New York, so I've been super excited to have this conversation, not only because of your experience, but because of the podcast background. So it's really interesting to see. It's nice to have someone that does podcasts as well on the show.
Yeah, I love having the podcast, man. You get to meet so many interesting people, and you get access to people that you normally wouldn't get access to. So it's been an amazing experience, man. I love it.
Yeah, and it leads us on very nicely to the first question I've got for you, Ryan. You've been running the Scale Up Show for about just over 3 years now, right? And having spoken to sales leaders and CEOs across the world, and what have been some of the most consistent traits these top performers have shown you or stood out to you within these conversations that you've had?
Yeah, what I would say is, Freddie, there's kind of like 3 core components that I look at, and in traits is like, I don't know, I like to narrow it. So I think there's like values, beliefs, and mindsets that all of those guests have had, right? Values, the ones that have performed the best, because I probably interviewed, like I shifted, I've always done CEOs, so there's probably been about 270-ish CEOs, most of them in tech, that I've interviewed. And if you look at values is always an area where what I've seen is they're highly, the ones that have done the best have been highly, highly, highly vested in trying to serve their customers better than anyone else, right? And that means going above and beyond and just really, really laser focusing on the result. So I think that's in terms of like what they value, what they believe that I've seen, which has been pretty cool. And this is consistent across the board. I would say for majority of them, probably 90% of them, is that it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when, right? And so they know that they're going to find a way, even if it's not originally what they dialed up, which is pretty interesting because most of the time, what they originally thought was their product or their solution that they created didn't end up being what actually hit the market really well, right? So that's the second one. And then mindset's the third one. I'm sure you hear about tremendous amount of grit and persistence, but and it kind of goes back to what Ryan Holiday says with or his book, the obstacle is the way, right? And so they look at failure not as something that they should avoid, but more as a requirement and just part of the process. And so when you mix all 3 of those in a blender together, those are some of the I guess, like non-business aspects that I've seen, all of them have like similarities around.
Yeah, makes sense. I mean, I think that pairs well with, I mean, obviously I've got limited experience in talking and running this podcast in the short lifespan that this has been going. But even just from that experience in my conversations that I've had so far, I think that all anchors around people. It's the biggest thing that kind of stood out to me is the ability to connect with someone, whether that's online or in person, just create relationships, be very honest, open, transparent. And I think as a sales leader, I had a great conversation with a guy called Jeremy Pankin as well last week about this. And he runs sessions with his team, not about pipeline, not about how they're doing, but just as people. What have they got going on? How can we connect? But I think that goes a long way.
Yeah, I agree with you. I mean, like I've seen, well, the times where I've gotten my team to work the hardest for me, be the most productive and most like engaged, was when I connected like what we were trying to do at a team level to what was like their ultimate goal personally, right? And emotionally, like were they trying to save, not just save money, right, to get a house, but were they trying to save money to get a house because they were planning on having kids within the next year and a half, and they didn't have enough space where they're at, and they wanted to move in a neighborhood with the right school district, all that stuff, right? So like, if you look at that level of layer and then you keep attaching like what they're trying to drive and remind them to go back to that, and not just remind them, but support them, like folks really, really appreciate that, because a lot of companies don't do that, believe it or not.
Yeah, no, I know, not enough of it, at least. And so, especially, I mean, it's super important in sales in general, I think. There's a lot of similarities I think you can pull between discovery and just having that, right? Just getting down to, what's the biggest driver, right? Take a little bit of a shift here. Obviously, you've had, as I mentioned earlier, many different roles in managed services and software and in enterprise sales specifically. And looking back at your experience at Pitney Bowes specifically, you mentioned that there was no current customer base when you joined in Chicago at the time. And how did you go about building a go-to-market strategy for a new market that they haven't attacked before, I'm assuming for the first time? And in hindsight, is there anything that you would have done differently?
Well, yeah, so it was interesting, man, because like, it was like a carousel of managers that didn't know what they were doing. So like, what happened was they were trying to start this new office. There was actually already existing reps there, but we didn't have any customers. And so like, it was just like trial by error. There's some weird stuff that we tried to work through, but essentially like, it was interesting because they kept bringing in new managers. Managers would stay there like 4 or 5 months and then they would churn, right? Either leave the company or leave the area because they didn't have the experience in the startup mode, right? They were like from big companies and like had a good pedigree. When it came from going to 0 to 1, that's a massively different skill than running a large organization with a lot of infrastructure, right? So that's just to kind of like level set. The other thing is like our sales enablement or our training was essentially, and this is a big adjustment for me because I was going from quote unquote inside sales, which is pseudo SDR, but I had to like sell the deal within 24 hours. That was Marcus Evans, which was like a boiler room, which is pretty funny. Like literally the movie Boiler Room, where you're like slamming 250 dials a day, like calling investment banks and brokerage companies. So anyways, I digress. So basically we had like a week of training. I was transitioning from inside sales to technically outside sales, right? Which is what they used to call it. And so it was more what I would classify mid-market, kind of who we were targeting. And so what I would do differently, like I tried, since we had no training after the initial week, I had no leadership that knew what they were doing. I had no sales team that like peers that really were executing. So what I started to do, there was other people in the company that had performed at a high level. So I kept trying to access them and then understand and deconstruct what they were doing, because that was like the fastest path for me in terms of success. And so I did that. The other thing that I did, that I got really creative with case studies. And so if organizations had a location in Chicago, I would reference those as Chicago customers, right? Which they technically were, right? So that was a way around the lack of references, because what we were doing was very location based as well. It wasn't like software. It was going on site, fixing and repairing things. So people were really concerned about that. If I had to do it all over again, what I would do differently is I think I would have leaned even heavier into modeling other people and getting their insights. And I mean, I would have probably even have offered them a commission share, even though the company wasn't doing that, if they helped me along with one or two deals or whatever, a handful of deals, and just for guidance and mentoring and coaching, giving them a cut of the deal, because that was something I did not do, right? That's one thing. The other thing that I think I would do is, like, if I was in that situation and I did not really connect and talk to a lot of other people in my position outside of my organization. So I would have definitely leaned harder into an external network in terms of creating that, because that would have given me a lot of insights and innovation that I could have brought of more well built out organizations to, kind of a startup-ish type environment. So those are two key things that I would do.
Yeah, it makes sense. That makes sense. It's interesting. I think there's, I had a good conversation with a VP at Attentive about the similar thing, where in which you're joining a company, especially if you've got experience within that startup phase, where there's not much structure, there's not much process, and you need those sales individuals to kind of adapt and jump in the deep end, if you will, to kind of thrive in that environment. Because, I mean, especially as sales leaders coming from larger companies, without that process, it can be, I guess, quite blinding, and doing things very, very differently to what they have been doing. For those that are kind of going through that transitionary period, based on your experience kind of doing both, what are some of the things that you would encourage people to focus on first, especially when moving, say, from a company that's got that process and structure that wants to kind of progress into a smaller company? What are the first things that you would say to someone that's kind of thinking about that?
Like making the jump from like a larger company to start, is what you're saying?
Yeah.
So yeah, I think kind of the key thing that I would approach it is, like, before, if you're looking to change jobs, or I would make sure that you talk and interview and almost grill their top performers before you even get in the door, right? And find out, like, what it took for them to actually do that and make that a realization. Because here's what I would say: even though there's a lack of infrastructure and resources, the beautiful thing about it is, if you like autonomy, you could create your own path, right? So what I would do is I would really, really get a deep understanding of that before I even made the jump. And then if that kind of checked the boxes and you're like, okay, I know in my heart and soul that I could execute against this, even though there's not a lot there. And some people like it. Like, I like it. I like creating and I like building. And so that's exciting for me. So that's one. The second thing that I would do is, after talking, and that's not just the rep, the leadership too, I would really, really look at, like I said, building that external network. It's so easy with all the communities out there and all the social media and everything to make that a reality, and work with other folks that are literally in your situation, right? That are at smaller companies, similar revenue range, I would say similar ownership structure, because there's a massive difference between being VC backed or being bootstrapped, right? If we're talking tech, right? VC backed is like pedal to the metal, high risk, as fast as you can. Now it's more based on profitable growth, but still, it's very aggressive. And then bootstrapped is more what I've seen, methodical, right? More methodical, profit driven, resource constrained. And so two totally different companies. Like, if you look at two different companies that are, like, say 10 million in revenue, and one's VC and one's bootstrap, I've seen a difference of, like, a bootstrap company will have 35, 40 people total in the company, and a VC company will have 150, right? Because the difference in resources. So, so those are things I would try and understand as well, if you're making the transition, like what type of environment you're going into, and then what would you really enjoy working in, right? Yeah. So those are the things I would focus on.
Yeah, makes sense. They also, what you mentioned there with having people to lean on, those communities. I think now, I mean, obviously I've only got to speak about this, software and in that environment and sales kind of community now, and there's so much out there, like Pavilion, RevGenius Sales Hacker, all thanks to obviously you and individuals that have kind of created and had a big impact on that. Kind of leads us on to the next question as well, quite nicely. Throughout your entire career in sales, sales is emotional, right? I mean, there's lots of ups and downs. It's not always going your way, right? If you could pin down one, what has been the toughest moment in your career? How have you dealt with it? And what advice would you give to others? Not necessarily to make the same mistake, or not make the same mistake, but if they're going through something similar, what advice would you give to better deal with it? If that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a great question, Freddie. And so I was thinking about this the other day, and I'm like, okay, what was the lowest, right? And there was like, I don't know, maybe 3 low points that I had, but the one that hurt, I think, the most was because I didn't see it coming. It was kind of like the rug was pulled out from me with like no warning, no coaching, any insight or whatever. And the reason why it was so painful was when I was actually running the mid-market team, and our team was doing really well numbers-wise. Like, we were above expectation in terms of numbers. We were one of the top performing offices. And however, I was working maybe 13, 14 hours a day, and all I thought about was work. I had 2 little kids at the time, so I was getting not a lot of sleep. Even when I had free time on the weekend, like it was to the level where I'd have my wife drive somewhere so I could do work all the time while she drove if we were going somewhere personal, right? So there wasn't a lot of downtime, and it was so singularly focused on work with a really aggressive founder in terms of what his expectations were. So even though I was performing, I was putting everything into the job, but I was kind of a dick to be around, right? Like, my team didn't like me anymore because, like, I thought, based on the coaching I was getting from the executives, that I could just pass that down to my team and treat them like I was being treated, right? And so what happened when I did that was I did get the results, but people didn't like working for me. And so what happened was I got demoted. So they took my entire team away from me. They brought in another guy to manage them, and it really, really hurt because, like, I didn't have a lot of respect for the person that they brought in, and but at the right time, it was probably the right move. And then, but the beautiful thing about it that happened was, even though that was one of probably my biggest lows at the time, because my ego was hurt, right? I was like, I'm performing, I gave you everything, and you demote me, right? And you got this knucklehead taking over for me, right? So that was my internal mindset. And then what happened was, like, they're like, okay, well, we want you to focus on large recurring revenue because you have a talent for that individually. And I think strategically you look at that. And so basically I had to start that enterprise team with no team. And I had to regain the trust of my team, my old team, back, and get them to buy in and focus 20 to 30% of their time on the enterprise side, and then build that and grow that. And then that's what became $30 million in ARR like 5.5 years later. So it was a pretty wild journey because it went from one of my biggest lows to one of my biggest accomplishments. And that's the advice I would give to other people, is like, looking back at my career, like, all the times that suck the most in my life, like, I've gotten fired 2 other times, right? And, one was a weird circumstance with COVID. The other, the company was around the financial crisis, and nobody at the company was selling any new customers. So, like, wasn't that I couldn't do anything better, but at the same time, there were some outside circumstances that pressed that. But every time I had that, something beautiful came out the other side because of the new opportunity that I took advantage of after that low and reinvented myself and built myself from the ground up. And so if you just got laid off or you got demoted, because I know there's tons of layoffs right now, like, that's something that I would say just near and dear to my heart. Like, remember that, and then look back at what you've done amazing in your life. It doesn't even have to be work related. Write all those things down, and then that'll give you the courage to try new things that you haven't done before.
For sales leaders that find them, I mean, it's very introspective. I think that situation in particular, and that is obviously a skill. And I think that for sales leaders with the kind of going through a similar thing, especially, as you mentioned before that scenario, before obviously you got demoted, to kind of get the kick up the arse and think, oh, something's not right. Yeah, how would you advise other sales leaders to to kind of look at their life and assess in that respect. Because I think with so much work, it's easy to get carried away, and not many people do it. I mean, how would you advise for people to do that?
Yeah, so it's so funny, man. Like I had a client who was the CEO of a publicly traded company, and I was having dinner with him, and I remember like we were sitting down and we're at a nice restaurant, and he's like, "How are things going with you?" And I was like, "Oh, man, things are tough. Like this is what's going on. I feel like all I do is work," and because like I became friends with him even though he was a client, and so one of the things is like, as a result of that, it was like, hey, have you heard of, like, I wasn't into I didn't even know how to spell personal development back then, right? He's like, hey, have you heard Tony Robbins at all before? And I'm like, I think I've heard of him, but I don't really know. He's like, he's got an event coming in Chicago. You should check it out. And I was like, all right. Like, would never even thought about going, but I was very unhappy in my life at the time. And there's one, and so basically I went to the event and it was life-changing. However, there's one single thing that I think anybody could do that's very simple. You don't need to go to an event, although I would recommend it. It was amazing. But one simple thing that you could do, because I see this with my clients, I see this with especially like revenue leaders. It's wild, Freddie, like how I see the patterns that I fell into, other people are falling into, where like every single minute of every single day is taken up, and they have to be back to back to back to back meetings, or back to back to back travel with meetings on. I mean, it's crazy. So anyways, the one thing that they could do is just draw a circle, right, on a piece of paper, and then cut it into, I think it's like 6 different like pie squares, or like pie sections, right? And what you want to do is you want to write, like, you have work in one, like work career in one, you have relationships, you have financial situation, you have fun, you have health. I'm trying to think if there's one more. Maybe it's only 5. Maybe that's it. I'm struggling. So I think it's 5. So you have each pie square in 5. And then what you do is you rank your level of happiness with that category in every section. Maybe the other one's growth, right? So there's 6 growth, like, and that's like learning, or contribution, right? And so what happens is you look at that and you basically shade it in. So, and it's hard to say if you're not doing it, but basically shade in like the proportion that you would. So if it's a 1, you barely shade any of it in that section, and do it all around. And so what'll happen is it's supposed to effectively be a wheel. So with that wheel, you'll have all different balance areas that should be pretty similar. But what I found is I would have parts of my life that were at a 7, like work, which was my highest at the time, was at a 7. And then like my health was at like a 2 or 3. My relationships were at like a 2 or a 3. My fun level was at a 1. And so like the idea is then, like, okay, just like you do if you're in that situation, like a high, hard charging type A, like I am, doing more of work isn't going to make you happy. What's going to make you happy is like evening out those other areas that you're deficient in, so you don't have like a broken wheel that you're trying to ride on. And then by fixing that and doing that and making, just like you do with goals and priorities every week for work, you do that same for the other categories. It'll be life-changing in terms of how you feel, which in actuality will create better results at work, and you'll be a better leader at work. So that was something that was really, really eye-opening, because the natural inclination is like, hey, just lean in more work, do more work, and you'll do better, and then you'll be happier. But that's actually the exact wrong way to look at it.
Yeah, great advice. Great advice. Yeah, I want to full stop on that, because I think that's great advice for people that obviously it's hard to know, right? But those little exercises are super important. With so much information out there, it goes back to all of those communities as well. Having people to lean on is so important in that. So now is the best time to kind of do that. Look introspectively anyway. Question 4, moving on. Using your time at Flex, building an enterprise sales team from scratch, and obviously your review other experience in management and services and software, what do you think should be top of mind for sales leaders wanting to improve and expand their enterprise sales function, specifically in 2023?
Okay. So this is the single biggest mistake. This is just in 2023. This is 2022. This is 2021. Mm-hmm. And it's crazy because like I've talked to so many CROs about this, VPs of sales, and it happens all the time. And what I am seeing is, because of all the methodologies and all the process that it's looked at, one of the core components for enterprise sales that leaders are ignoring is the emotional strategy that you have within the account, right? Because you'll have anywhere from like medic or medpic, right? Is a kind of a qualification methodology of a sales process. You might use challenger sales, right? So there's like a whole conglomeration of kludged together solutions that people have. But one of the things that folks don't focus on a lot, and I've talked to really high level people too, which is wild, is that they don't focus on, okay, as you go through the sales process, how do you orchestrate all the different levels of emotional and personal wins, like or KPIs for every individual that's involved in the sales process. Okay. And why this is critical is because you have to manage it vertically, you have to manage it horizontally, and you have to manage it emotionally, right? So there's kind of like 3 different levels. And then at the same time, you also have to manage politics, and you also have to manage individual wins as well as enterprise wins, right? And so it's like mixing all that together and looking at that systematically over the length of the sales process or engagement. And I see a lot of folks not really looking at it that way. And that was like game changing for us, because we would sometimes have like our product was average, mediocre, wasn't amazing. Our fulfillment wasn't amazing, right? But we developed really deep relationships. And I've seen it specifically when you look at 2 reps side by side, reps that executed at a very high level, they could have like 1/3 of the amount of pipeline as a rep that was just like a hard driver and ignoring that. And as a result, and they would get like 150% of the results. So it was like mind blowing. So that's one. The other thing too is, and it's, I could emphasize or be empathetic with why people haven't done this, is really, really integrating AI into your business. And what I mean by that is having the center of excellence. Like if you're a revenue leader, having a center of excellence with your team and looking at this weekly. And there's a couple of reasons for it. One, it could basically multiply 10x what you're doing in terms of time and or quality, right? So if your team isn't looking at this as a continuous process improvement, you're gonna like walk right by this, right? And so that's one. And I don't mean just like using a tool. I mean like there's so much happening. There's basically 5 years of innovation that's being crammed into 4 months. So you will catapult exponentially further ahead of your competition if you're leveraging these tools and insights than if you're not. So I would say have your team look at this, do a best practice session once a week with them, have them all experiment and test, and then everybody brings their best case, or I should say their best example of what they discovered or what they found, whether it's with ChatGPT, whether it's with like DALL-E or Midjourney, which are the graphics ones, and or tools, and find out like what are the best formulas or recipes to leverage this to either save time, increase the speed in which you're servicing your customers, or increasing revenue. So those are kind of like the 3 levers you could pull, right? And so those are the 2 areas that I think a lot of folks aren't paying attention to, which is wild because of how critically life-changing they are for results, revenue, and then relationships.
I know we're running close to the end of our session here, Ryan, but if you had to pick one tool that you're most excited about, I know that's obviously probably going to be a hard choice, one tool, AI tool that you're currently most excited about now in your day-to-day routine, what would it be?
Yeah, I would say ChatGPT. Yeah. And the reason for that is because I am seeing they're iterating it, right? It was like a raw surface before, a raw canvas. And so what they're doing now is they're integrating basically recipes into the solution, and they're also opening up for plugins, which is kind of like the app store for ChatGPT. So it's going to accelerate everything even faster to the point where it's almost scary because our technology is scaling at a faster rate than the way we emotionally deal with it, which is a whole nother situation, right? But I would say that at its simplest level, because that's going to be the platform that a lot of companies and tools are built on. And so if you understand that at a deep level foundationally, there's so many things you can do with it.
Amazing. And we're going to wrap up now with a question from our previous guest, Jeremy Painkin, who's the VP of Global Sales at Cascade. Now, he asks you, right, economic downturns like this, where are you digging the most and why? So yeah, within downturns like this, as we're in, where are you digging the most and why?
Yeah, and I even looked at this in my own businesses, right? I would say is the quality lever, right? Like resources are constrained, capital is constrained. So there's multiple ways where you could leverage the quality lever. And I even wrote a post about this on LinkedIn, but you could, just by improving one step in your conversion process, you can increase revenue 10%, right? Everybody wants to default to more, but I even did this with social media where I'm like, hey, I'm going to make a dedicated effort to exponentially improve the quality of what I'm putting out there. And I got 10x the results and basically I should say I got 3x what I got in the entire year of results in terms of views, engagement, all that, I got in 3 months, right? So the quality lever, I think, is the most underutilized situation. I even posted on Jason Lemkin's post on SaaStr as well about that. So quality, quantity, and speed.
Amazing. Ryan, it's been an absolute pleasure. I know we've been pushed for time, but fantastic to speak to you regardless. If anyone wants any resources about Ryan, Scale Up Show, and Whale Boss, or any other things that Ryan is involved in, there'll be some show notes and links down in the description. Before you go, Ryan, is there one thing that you want to leave the audience with, one final parting word or advice that you want to mention?
Yeah, I'm going to stop this because they're too busy doing their job. And I think that the changes in AI that are happening is going to be one of the, if not the single biggest change in mankind in the fastest period of time that we've ever experienced. So instead of running away from it, run towards it and be one of the leading adopters and innovators. And it could be game changing for you, your life, and your career.
Amazing. Ryan, amazing. It's been an absolute pleasure. I really appreciate it.
Awesome, man. Thanks for having me on. Really appreciate it. It was fun, Freddie.
Cheers, guys.
Cheers.